Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is James Herring. I'm a big data and advanced analytics architect with Microsoft. I'm on the what's called the Global Black Belt team. And what we basically do is there's about 8 of us worldwide, and we interact closely with the DPSAs, the Cloud Solution Architects, DSAs, and all those guys to kind of keep them on track with where they need to be and stuff. But a little bit about me. I mean, I do a lot of Azure ML stuff, a lot of Hadoop, HDN site. Don't do a lot of Cloudera, typically because of the licensing, but Hortonworks on-premise or in the cloud is pretty relevant. I came from an incubation team where we built analytics platform system, which prior to that we called SQL Server PDW 2012, which was an acquiring from Data Allegro, which was a PostgreSQL database about 2008. So this class is really designed for, our certification is really targeted towards data geeks, people that love the data, love to munge the data, and love to be able to get some impact and analysis out of it. It does help to have relevant work experience where you can work on the tools that we're going to be tested on a day-to-day basis. It's hard to jump in and out of Azure ML, personally to me, to be able to maintain the level I need to test out on some of this stuff. So I just did a 473, which is more around the design and implementing cloud data platform solutions. This one is on 475, which is design and implementing big data analytics solutions. So there is somewhat of a discussion. I also meant to tell you, Lambda is also a piece that you'll want to be familiar with. The batch processing versus real time, and we'll cover a little bit that during this as well. You don't need to know it in deep detail, you just need to understand the basic concept and constructs underneath it, which will be very important to help understand the questions and how you're going to tackle the problems. Got the picture? All right. So the exam basics, it's going to be about a 2 to 3 hour exam. So it's very important that you, someone like me does not eat a lot of carbohydrates before I go to the exam, so I'm not falling asleep halfway through it. You can review the questions and you can mark the questions. In fact, that's a recommendation. Let me click on this here. Mark what you want to review, because sometimes on these exams, if you do see a problem that may look familiar or may not look so familiar, you can mark it, come back to it, because you may see a relevant question that helps you solve that question. It does happen. It does also help you remember to mark every question with an answer. That's very important too, because this isn't an exam where it takes away points from your final score. Each question gives you a point or not. So you need to get to that level versus subtracting from a level. Kind of the same concept, I guess. There are 3 to 4 case studies with this in this exam, and you can't move between the case studies. So one of the takeaways from that to me is, and it's a common thing, as someone at Microsoft, we get these exams pretty regularly, and the first thing we're always told is take the exam, fail it, find out where you're weak. And what I say is go take the exam and fail it. These are all released exams, meaning that you can retake the exam for free, right? How many exam takers have we had here? You guys have certified before? Okay. So you know that once it's released, you have a retake for free. After 24 hours, you can go back and retake it, and then you have up to 5 weeks max. Maybe 4 weeks. Don't hold me on that. So the idea is that you want to be able to go into it, because I found many test centers. It's not a monitor like this, it's more a monitor like this, very small, and you have to pan back and forth between the questions and what your possible answers are. Even if it's a drag and drop when you're trying to do a sequence of events for like an Azure ML model, you can't even see all the answers that you put in there on the page at the same time. It's very frustrating for someone like me. They will give you a piece of paper and pencil that they provide, and you can always ask for more paper. And I'm a note taker, so I actually do outlines whenever I'm reading one of the problems. And I find through that in the process of elimination, it works really well. Another piece, let's see, let me go to this slide as well. This is important too. It's not designed to trick you. It's designed to verify that you know and you're confident in what you're doing, so you can go and put it on your resume and actually be qualified to do it. There is no partial credit, which I wish there were. I'd love to see a 0.8 on my exam because I think my grades would be much higher than a pass or fail on a 4-part question. So much easier. But there is no partial credit. But there are also no points. Again, like I said, there's no points deducted for a wrong answer. You only get a point for each right answer. And it does have a cut score. And here's a tip. Use those bookmarks to answer all your questions, right? If there's something you're uncomfortable about, you don't like the question, mark it, move on. What I would suggest is that you follow that old rule of thumb, which is to take your first answer that comes to mind and at least put it in there and then mark it and come back to it, because it's an old trick that I think we were taught earlier on, is that typically the first answer that comes to your mind is probably the right answer. Going back and changing it does not result in a correct response in most cases. So the major areas of the test, and this goes back to what we were discussing before, there's 25 to 30% of designing machine learning solutions inside this exam. There's also 20 to 25% of designing big data batch processing and interactive solution. This is where the Lambda architecture comes into play. And then there's also operationalized end-to-end analytics cloud solutions in here, which we'll discuss. And then, of course, design big data real-time processing solutions. And just so you guys know, these are slides that we used internally for the training. These weren't slides that were just prepped for you guys. If you see any that says Microsoft Confidential, let me know. I'll take it off. These are no longer confidential slides. So, first piece that we want to discuss is where will you land the big data, right? And as an architect, I'm going to tell you it depends. As a test taker, I'm going to say it depends upon the use case that's provided to you inside the exam. So we do have a few options. The Azure storage, be it table, blob, file, or queue. HD Insight is also, I don't think you'll see any data lake questions yet, or data lake analytics questions in it yet. But I would expect that if you take it within the next, after 3 months, that you may start seeing data lake and SQL data warehouse questions in this as well. So make sure that you study, hit it for a good solid month, and then go take the exam, fail it, find out where you're weak, go back and revisit what you did. But don't study for a month and then take a month off and then go try to take the exam, because it may actually change dramatically. The way Azure works in the event you guys don't know is that we have preview mode. In preview, they'll do updates pretty much weekly. They don't announce the updates when they do them, they just do them. And then we actually have GA. And once it's GA, the notes are a little bit, the updates are much less frequent. And they may be somewhat biannual in some cases. Typically, I still see them every quarter, but it really depends. The best place to go and look is go to the Azure, then the product, then the documentation. The first thing they're going to have is the latest notes, and then they're going to have a kind of a history of all the updates that have been placed in there. That's the best place to look, and it's by product team. So there's not one team that does Azure. There's about 25 different teams that I deal with on a regular basis that do different components within Azure. So your data lake guys and your data lake analytics guys, they work together somewhat, but they do releases on their own. They don't coordinate between each other in all cases. So you want to know Azure SQL for sure. And then you also want to know SQL Server IaaS on Azure VMs. And you want to know the ramifications of IaaS, what the purpose is, what the, you may want to know something about the CapEx, OpEx opportunities there, who's responsible for patching, who's responsible for licensing, that kind of stuff. And then document DB, you'll see as well. So to cover some of the data ingestion, some of the questions that you might see is how I want to handle a one-time bulk copy data load, right? Again, it depends on the use case and how it's formulated in the question. Read the question, use the paper, write down the main points, and don't be distracted by filler information. There's typically some very key points that are in the questions, pretty easy to follow once you start identifying the pattern. I'll talk about the testing we use within Microsoft that most everybody uses. And it's great after you've done the month of study, start doing the practice tests if you can afford it. I think it's usually $99 to $150. Well worth it if that's what your goal is to get certified. Let's see. And then you also have the on-premise versus cloud solutions. This day and age, there's a lot of hybrid approaches. Some of it's for ease of use, some of it's for political needs within the organization. But it is valid, and it's also in this exam as well quite often. Then you might also have something, how would I deal with small routine writes on a continual basis? And this may not be your telemetry type data that's going through an event hub. This may be something that's more small and batched and also partitioned. So understand when you're going to partition data, how you're going to partition it, how to set up certain events within Azure Data Factory, and understand these different tools here. With the interactive, we've got PowerShell, we've got AZ Copy. With Data Lake, we have some new ones. They're actually good. We have some, the stuff that's Linux-based. Of course, Microsoft loves Linux. Visual Studio, and then Hadoop command line. If you're not familiar with some of the Visual Studio tools, SQL Server data tools, also the Hadoop tools, it wouldn't hurt you to actually do a few use cases around those, because I think being able to understand those UIs, work through the problems or use cases with them, and actually utilize them, you're going to build that muscle memory that's going to actually help you when you don't get to see it and you actually have to drag items in a sequential order to answer a one-point question. Very frustrating again. And I actually don't have it with me, but I had a couple screenshots of some of those problems, but I think you guys can probably figure out what I'm talking about when you can't see it all. With the streaming data, Stream Insight, is really probably one of the biggest pieces. Storm is in there quite a bit, not as much with the RX stuff or the custom third party that I've seen, but I've seen a lot of Stream Insight and Storm for sure on this. Automation, Azure Data Factory, understand that it's a pipeline, workflow engine, the lineage capabilities of it, when to actually set up and build a default or data management gateway. And this is where I was mentioning before, if you guys heard, like something like PDW, you may see a question around PDW as a source, and understand that PDW comes with a default or data management gateway on the control node of the appliance. Also think outside the box a little bit too. I've had a couple customers where they're an AIX shop and they won't allow a Windows-based system in their house. So what they did was they basically set up a data management gateway on a VM, set up a VPN tunnel to it. They had it in the cloud, actually going back to an Oracle AIX instance and pulling data back. So if you understand that, then I think you'll have plenty of knowledge to be able to go through and work through those. Custom Azure, the Azure SDK, you'll see a little bit around that, more around PowerShell, I think, is what I've seen. And the PowerShell, the way I treat PowerShell is basically look at what they're asking for in the question. And PowerShell is not, it's not as widely adopted as I think Microsoft expected it would be. But with Azure growing and the need to repeat processes or maybe pause instances on demand or in down peak times, then I think we're going to see it grow a little bit more. And the key there is really just look for what they're asking. If they're asking you to create something, the last thing you want to do is do something that has no create mechanism inside the script, right? Log files, Flume, you'll want to understand what Flume is. You'll want to understand some SSIS that it's an option. I don't think I've seen a lot of the SSIS stuff that's really in there, and if you have any SSIS experience, which probably you do, it's not going to be a problem for you, probably. But I would look at some of the 2014, 2016 elements within SSIS and how they interact with the cloud, for sure. Relational side, look up Scoop. Again, do some of the SSIS for processing, and then Polybase. Polybase will be more directly related to the APS side versus SQL Data Warehouse or SQL 2016. At the last time I saw this, SQL 2016 is not on this either. But again, it could be out there anytime since it's been GA for some time. But be familiar with Polybase is. You guys all know what Polybase is, I assume? A few of you? So Polybase is basically a, for lack of a better word, a federated query engine that allows you to use T-SQL to communicate with a Hadoop cluster or a blob store. So it gives you an inherent built-in flexibility, even from SQL 2016 on-premise, to push and pull data to a blob store. Now, likewise, if you have on-premise Hadoop clusters, be it CloudDuo, Hortonworks on Windows or Linux, then you, or a Polybase HD Insight cluster, I'm sorry, APS HD Insight cluster, you can push and pull data very high speed to those on-premise clusters using T-SQL as well. It's a very, very powerful tool. But the main element here is to just understand what it is and how it works. The constructs that are inside of it are more like Hive queries than anything. You're going to create external tables, and then you're going to use other NPP type of queries. At least on PDW, you're going to do something like a CTAS, which is a create table select, or a CRTAS, create remote table select, or CETAS, create external table select, versus a select into, which you would use with SQL 2016. So pretty straightforward. A little bit of changes in the syntax, but we're working on that. Again, the scenarios are ingesting data, which could come from device management type of systems, ingesting components, and being able to understand the considerations when implementing ADF. And that really goes back to, do I need to implement a data management gateway or not? And then some of the target scenarios may be around sentiment or IoT. This is where you may be ingesting data and then doing either a batch processing against Azure ML, or you may be doing just immediate processing where you're just using a stored procedure of var binary max to actually call a stored procedure that executes R code on a server. So the questions around that aren't that difficult, and if you understand the basic premise and the logic, I think it'll be pretty easy for you to understand. So some of the data access and authorization, this is again, data management gateway. You're gonna see ADF a lot, I think, in this. ADF is utilized a lot in this exam. I would say in practical app, it's utilized a lot, but it doesn't take as much of a forefront in other scenarios that it does in this exam. But you wanna have considerations with ADF. Is it the right tool? What's your in-house type capabilities around it? Do you have JSON in-house? Do you have SQL 2016, which is JSON compliant or aware? Because everything in ADF has a JSON script behind it. You don't have to worry about any of the tools like Tableau, bless you, any of the tools like Tableau or anything like that that may integrate with ADF. But as an aside, you may want to know about them. When they're expensive too, they're actually very good. But they leverage a lot of the ADF stuff underneath. Storage key management, you want to know when and how to swap out keys and keep everything up and running. The use of secondary keys, best practices around that. And then the shared access services, same thing, best practices, approaches, when and where to do it. When it comes to HD Insight clusters, you really want to know what types. You've got an Apache Spark, Apache HBase, Apache Storm. There's some stuff that's in preview that uses solid state you don't need to worry about yet. Again, timing is everything. I'll also say that the R server on Spark, it's in preview, so you don't need to worry about it yet. But as soon as it goes GA and comes out, then you've got about a 6-week time span to where it may be implemented. And if you haven't used it, it's actually very powerful, great tool, especially if you're in R shop. So with Spark, some of the stuff that we cover is, within it is the easy ingestion from Blob Store for sure, right? Blob Store is a big piece of everything in Azure, as much as we would like Data Lake to be a bigger piece. Blob Store, you need to understand the limitations of the block blob, file sizes, that kind of stuff, versus like Data Lake, which could be out there at any time. Data Lake's not in preview anymore, so it could be out there at any time. I haven't seen it yet. But as just practitioners, it's great to understand that there's really tight integration with Data Lake, especially if you're building a Hadoop cluster, because it can be used as secondary storage. inside of that and give you a lot better performance, because blob storage, let's be honest, is just kind of a dummy blob storage. Whereas Data Lake is an HDFS backed system where you can grow that 299 gigabyte file in block blob to 299 gig or so, and you can grow that same file to over a petabyte in Azure Data Lake. I haven't seen anything with Azure Data Lake Analytics yet either, but with it being a new language with USQL, that may not come into play except into a later development type of application or testing. But if you haven't used it, it's actually very powerful. The pricing structure is a little complex because it allows you to spin off nodes. But the key, if it does come up, is to understand what it's for, when to use it, and that it's also that you can store any data type and query any data type within it, right? So if I need images, video, and I want to write code that goes out and it does aggregations of and grabs frames from within video, I have the ability to do that within Data Lake. Block blob, I couldn't do that easily without bringing up a Hadoop cluster. You understand concurrent user processing for sure, what the limitations are. Caching for sure, with the in-memory being the best performant, but you also have the SSDs, which can help reduce the cluster size in total. Again, with all these with HD Insight, you also want to look at a different implementation approach and understand that based on the class of SSDs, memory, and all that stuff that you need, depends on where you start at. And then if you need to grow from that, you have that flexibility. So be able to understand the different class and performance of those different machines, and then integration. And then of course we've got Event Hub and Kafka. I haven't seen a lot of Kafka stuff that's really tight on the code. It's more about how to implement it and where it's at inside the process. So HBase, remember that these exams are also adaptive, right? So if you struggle in a particular area, it may stay around in that area for a bit. I haven't actually run into any issues with the HBase side of it, but it is a NoSQL type database, very similar to like a document DB, MongoDB type stuff inside of it, more of a key value pair storage mechanism. I think where you get into it is when to use it, right? That's a big piece. When would you want to use HBase? Understand some of the sharding tables, some of the storage mechanisms, be it ORC or RC file. And I think they also, Parquet is also on the HD Insight as well now. So, but also understand some of the downfalls from an organizational implementation of it, right? Especially if you're trying to take that data and make sense of it at the end of the day or within a certain processing constraints. I don't think that'll be on the exam. I just think it's good practice. Know the components and their utilities. Ambari, right? If you're going to use, how do you monitor a Hadoop cluster in Hadoop or Hortonworks or HD Insight? And it's still going to be Ambari. Uzi with the workflow management, HCatalog with Templeton, Zookeeper for coordination, and then of course Scoop, which I don't think anybody uses anymore, of the data integration between RDBMS and HDFS. What's not on here is Yarn, which is yet another resource negotiator, which comes into play as well, and adds a lot of performance to it. Know the technologies and the frameworks to use within them, but also know that they're flexible, right? Just because you are hitting, again with Polybase, this comes into play, just because you have a Hadoop cluster doesn't mean you have to write Hive queries that are in batch mode. But understand that if you do write Hive queries against Hadoop, that everything is in a batch mode unless you're hitting against a real time like Spark or something like that. Understand Spark SQL, Flume, Python, Pig, PowerShell, how they relate to it. I don't think you have to go really, really deep in these. I've not seen anything that's really deep. It's more about aligning a situation. They may give you a scenario, and you just need to know and align those with your solution on it. So, and this is when we were talking about, I didn't create these slides. I actually should recognize the guy that did create them. When I remember his name, I will. He's a guy up in Northeast District to work with. But if I have a large volume of historical sensor data and it's semi-structured, and I want to look at data from each system, and then isolate inconsistencies and view that data visually, if you look at that, the tools that you would use are probably Hive, Hadoop, and Microsoft Excel. I would probably argue that's dated because that's still an option, but I see other tools that could do the same type thing because semi-structured also is a SQL DW type of thing. With the Hive queries, those are batch, and I could do real-time queries with SQL DW, and then I could use Excel, Power BI, anything I wanted to on top of that. Not to say that you can't use Power BI on top of the Hadoop as well, right, to do batch-based queries. And then the other one, of course, I have sensor data coming in near real time from a number of different locations that needs to be monitored by a dashboard type of application. And this, I don't know if you can see the arrow, is point to Event Hub, Storm, Cluster, and DS3 JavaScript. So in this scenario, I would probably say, well, we use telemetry data. We've got Event Hub. We've got a dashboard that's doing it. And then we're using on-demand HD Insight with ADF and Power BI. Can do the same thing and be much less expensive. I would also know that the differences between the best practices around HD Insight, if you're going to have to write Hive queries, know that it's best to store them maybe in a secondary drive like in Data Lake, because it's a recommended best practice that when you're done with the workload within HD Insight, to kill it. You can pause it, but you're going to get charged for the full month, and it's not cheap. Even on a Linux-based cluster, you're probably looking at $500-600 a month. So the best practice is to actually store your Hive queries on a separate drive, be it Blob Store or Data Lake, into that. This slide came out a little messed up. So think solutions and scenarios, right? And again, don't argue. It's not trying to be a trick question. It's just looking for the right question in the basic sense and terms, right? We don't want to do too much what ifs and that kind of stuff. We just want to take it at its basic context. So in this case, Company X is a large Microsoft shop, and they're looking to reduce their costs. They have a legacy SQL Server database that they would like to take off-premise, right? There's a key word for you, I think. The database is approximately 230 gigabytes and will double every year, and users need 5 years worth of data. So we know that it's going to double every year, and they need at least 5, right? 230 times 5. That takes us to a certain point with the data disk size. And then it has less than 2,500 users are authorized to access the server, though about 50 Active Directory roles, or through about 50, I think that should be through 50 Active Directory roles. And in this case, the Azure VM with SQL Server is actually meeting the size measurement as well as the authentication. I would argue with this, but I'm not going to, because I know that that's the right answer that would be in the exam. You have to, this is one of those things where you have to know when you're taking the exam if things have changed within the limitations of like Azure SQL database that may now support 2 terabytes. If it's a 2016 version and they're using clustered column store index, then the compression ratio is going to average about a 5x. That's what they're going to market, but based on the data, it could be much higher. I've seen up to 163x compression on a clustered column store index. So it took a 10 terabyte data warehouse to a little bit over 38 gig. So it's still questionable, but that's really not overthinking it and trying to do it. With Storm, we want to understand that it's real-time analytics, that the data is streaming, and the queues can be Kafka, Azure Service Bus queues, or Event Hub. The scenarios that this would cover would be IoT, fraud detection, social analytics, Twitter, that kind of stuff, ETL, network monitoring, and mobile apps. Let's see, design, provision, compute resources. I'm trying to go through the boring stuff quick. Stream analytics, Storm, Event Hub, real-time event processing, real-time event storage, and understanding that there is transient data that may not be completely accurate. And this gets into what our next piece will be, which will be the Lambda architecture. And then configuring cluster sizes. We don't want to overscale because if we do, we can pay for resources we're not going to utilize for some time. And that's just, it's not a good practice at all. And of course, resource assignment. So the following slides that are coming up they kind of start from a base, and then at the end it builds onto it. But some of the key principles of the Lambda architecture, like it or love it. Complexity, it takes into account complexity is hard to scale, keep things simple and easy to reason about, right? And it takes into a human fault tolerance into that as well. So the architecture itself is meant to be somewhat generic, fault tolerant, and outwardly scalable to support a wide range of networks and use cases. So you have your data, and then you have different layers of that data. In the batch layer, that's where you're going to really have your really good, clean data to speak about. When you have your speed layer, that's your transient data that may not be as reliable and may actually not be reliable enough that it's actually discarded. And you could also have incomplete data inside that as well. And then the serving layer is going to be your visualizations, your queries, that kind of stuff. So if you look at it from a Microsoft traditional perspective, it still fits within some of the frameworks that we have. But the key principles of the storage layer are really, be able to store the data, and this is a data warehousing thing, right? Be able to store it at the lowest grain, the rawest possible form. And, this is what they call the master data set. And there are some terms used in here that are going to conflict with what we do in data warehousing. So if you're data warehouse guys, I did not write this because although it is somewhat true with some of the normalization is not exactly the same normalization we're talking about in data warehousing. The master data is immutable, and it's also fully normalized. And what they're basically saying is that it's true, it's in perpetuity. It does change. If it does change, it doesn't change often. And each piece is atomic by nature. So there are variants of what it's a hybrid, if in all intents and purposes. The data is a fact-based model. Again, this is also an argumentative term, where the data piece is atomic and time-stamped. But when we talk about fact-based model, I think what they're looking at basically is that it's at its rawest form. And when they say fact-based, they just mean they've got the detail for all of the master data, what they refer to as the master data inside of that. And then, of course, they bring in the whole random number piece, which talks about surrogates in our world. The principles of the speed piece is, and this is probably the more complex part of it, right? This is when you're talking about being able to send sensor data, IoT type stuff, to a toll booth and have 4 lanes of cars coming in and just dropping coins in and tracking license plate in, license plate out, that kind of stuff. So the data is incrementally, it's updated and constrained. I wouldn't say it's so much complex implementation. The partitioning logic within that is somewhat complex because it may span across timestamps, and then you may disregard some data as well. The speed layer looks only at recent data. So this is where I'm talking, it's not a persistent data storage, it's very volatile. And it does allow random writes and results, again, are transient. And then the batch layer, this is probably the key piece, and this is a key piece for anybody, right? It looks at all the data at once, it takes all that transient data, it mashes it up, it looks up keys, matches it up, and then it also handles exceptions and everything else. I'm looking for something that I can't argue with here. It does serve denormalized views. They're constantly being produced through the batch layer. And this is support the random access reads. So if a user comes in, they want to see a snapshot in a point in time. This is kind of a batch mode. If you look between this hour and this hour, here's the data that was processed before, and then here's the transient layer that comes in underneath. So you can kind of see, that's where the stream insight and everything else comes into play. Being able to understand that is what's important for the exam. So here, this kind of gets into some of the stuff. The batch view, that's all the data, real-time view, current real-time data, and new data that's coming in. And then query, that's the batch view in real time. So that's really where we consolidate the two. This is probably the best slide to help understand some of it. Probably should have showed that first. But with ingestion, you gotta understand the different technologies that we have underneath. at the time and when and where to use them. Some of it's preference, some of it's best practice, some of it just depends on the day of the week, I think. But that's the great thing about this, right, is the flexibility, which makes our jobs as technologists a little bit more difficult. And some of it's political, which makes it even more fun, right? So the big piece with this is like I said, you've got the ingestion, stream processing that happens, and you've got your batch layer with the batch processing comes into place, and then the batch view serving. This is, you can see it has Azure SQL Data Warehouse on it. Again, I've not seen it on the exam, but it's been out long enough that it could show up. The biggest piece to remember about Azure SQL Data Warehouse is that it utilizes blob store, and it uses local disks. It has premium storage as its default, but you can grab a key, put it up into an admin would basically configure the key, configure the trust, and then people can push and pull data to it all day long. So if you've got systems that are pushing data into SQL DW, it's on demand. As soon as it's there, you can query it. The coolest thing about DW, just as an aside, is that, and the blob storage, is that it changes how we do some of this batch processing stuff. Because if you know the structure of your data is coming in, and it's clean, and it's in a structure that can be read, you can actually do ETL with just a copy and paste. And that's one of the coolest things to me, because especially when you take the MPP aspect of it, and I can put all this massively parallel processing this across distributions and just start throwing files in it, query it in real time, and do an aggregation and get my results in, what used to take us days can happen in seconds. And if it's not fast enough, I have the ability to grab a slider and scale it out to where I can get twice the horsepower if I need to. And when I'm done, I can pause it. The data's still available. It's persisted inside of the blob store or data lake, and I can query that with Power BI. So it's a great thing. I wish we had it 20 years ago. Oh, sorry, I missed this part. The analytics clients. This is where we've got Power BI and Excel, Azure ML. Custom apps, command line, those are available too. You're not going to see anything about third-party tools here. But no, in the real world, Tableau, MicroStrategy, all these tools can interact with and use these tools very well. Again, architecture, it's meant to be generic, fault tolerant, and outwardly scalable to support a wide range of workloads and use cases. So this actually shows the tools that are used behind each piece. So with the master data set, we've got HD Insight, Blob Store, MapReduce, Pig, Hive, Oozie, and SSIS. Not seeing a lot of SSIS actually used in practical apps, but I do see a lot of demand for it. The tools that you're going to use to present it up front, Azure Storage Explorer, Excel, Power BI, the basic tools, nothing really strange here. And then the last layer is going to be your batch layer is the Stream Insight, real-time layer. Stream Insight, Spark, Azure SQL Database, or SQL DB, Azure Tables, and then tools like Memcache and MongoDB. And I think they're sharing these slides after the presentation too. Yeah. So then when we get to the machine learning, this is probably a more changing thing. And if you guys don't know, there's a machine learning cheat sheet that's been published. Have y'all seen that? I would recommend that you download it, familiarize yourself with it, and do it. I do a lot of that stuff. I use Jump and other tools as well. And I'll do a simple jump, maybe a bootstrap forest, and I'll take it and do a boosted tree and compare the two against each other's score and then evaluate them and see which one I'm doing. Then I'll actually start branching out and doing all kinds of crazy stuff with it. So within the exam, though, ML Studio is an important piece. I think it's important in a practical sense to understand that ML Studio is in the old version of the Azure dashboards. You can't see it in the new one yet, so you have to go back to the old one. And that's probably one of the only reasons it's not cut off yet over there. Setting up the experiment, you want to understand how to set it up, and then how ADF and other utilities integrate with it. Monitoring and alerting, how to set that type of stuff up within ADF. Modules and what they do with the data sets, split, profiling, and cleansing. Are you guys data scientists, either of you? Okay. You've got a lot of experience with ETL tools, SSIS, and stuff like that? Okay, good. That's good. I see a lot of data scientists I work with, they know R or they know Python, but you mentioned tools like Informatica, SSIS, and they're deer in the headlights. But we're changing that slowly. If you really want to get deep into this too, I would recommend, if you're not a data scientist or if you're not as familiar with the Microsoft tools, to go to the edX, the Microsoft Professional Program. It used to be called a Professional Degree with a Data Science tract. You can audit it completely free. I was fortunate to get on the accelerated track with that, and I look at it from a perspective of if I'm trying to get my foot in the door, these are the tools that I need to do it. Now, I think they did an outstanding job of that, and that's not a plug on them, but the difference is that I think most of the DBAs or the architects that are Microsoft-centric that haven't had a strong stats background are going to struggle somewhat with it, right? And that's where the cheat sheet can help, but if they don't understand what they're trying to do with these regression trees and the boosted force and everything else, then it's just going to be a missed opportunity. So, but they do a good job. But they do. The biggest complaint I would say is that if you have no statistics background, go to Coursera or edX and take some basic statistics courses. I mean, very basic, or enroll, because the one on edX starts at probably an intermediate with you. They think that you already understand Bayesian algorithms and everything else, so they're going to do that, or Bayesian model. So some of the basic steps to understand with this, and this is from David Chappell and Associates, you'll see that this model has changed, but it's still relevant in the exam. You know, you apply the pre-processing to the data. That's where you mine your data, cleanse it, do all of that. And then you apply, this makes it look so simple, doesn't it? You apply the machine learning algorithm, then you get a candidate model. When you get a candidate model, then you actually deploy the chosen model. The fun stuff where I think Azure ML takes a lead in this, and this is me being my, I'm also an evangelist, so sorry, is where we take the lead is being able to expose that trained model as an API and a REST API to be able to call, and to be able to feed that to Java or anything, and then that's when you get the power. But again, just like most other tools when it comes to data and stuff, most people don't realize the effort that's involved in the pre-processing of the data, right? SMOTE is one of the funnest things I think I've got to play with in that. And then handling the empty, the null values and all that stuff, which are always relevant, and how to handle them properly. With JUMP and some of those tools, the categorization of the data itself is very important. It's just as important here. And understanding that is important for this exam, at least for this part of it. So this talks more about, and see, there's one of those Microsoft confidential things. It's not confidential. So it was just part of an image that was pasted in the slide. So you want to know how to provision the workspace as an IT pro, get the Azure subscription, create the workspace. And then you want to know how to get prepared data, build, edit the graph, run experiments. I think you want to understand also, you're not going to see probably much to do with the R or the Python elements. And what I haven't seen it yet. And the questions that I've seen will be basically around, you want to be able to consume data from a web service and then cleanse it. And it'll ask you the steps that you need in order to query that. And they'll have stuff in there that also has splits, when to use a split, how to set the sampling rate, all that stuff. I haven't seen anything where it gets into seeds, but it's important as a practitioner to understand how to use seeds, especially if you want someone else to be able to repeat the same results that you saw. And then to publish the train as a web service, you'll see some of this. Again, it's adaptive. So if you struggle with some bits of this, you may see more questions than not on this. But it basically gets into saving the trained model and all that stuff. It's really not that difficult. Some of the definitions that you will run into from at least the basic stuff are the regression, anomaly detection, which is, you know, it says in here that it's used for fraud detection. It's actually used for a lot more than just fraud detection. It's used in manufacturing systems as well. Clustering algorithms, this is just a basic k-means clustering for a lot of it, where it's trying to group patterns and do that. You have a lot of control over that, so you can, there's just enough rope to hang yourself right off the edge, if you will, with all these things. Classification, and this is where the cheat sheet really comes into play, is knowing which type of classification model you want to use, because it'll tell you based on the number of labels that you have or the decisions that you need to make, which one's the best. And since this exam was originally done, they have added so much to it. I don't know if you guys go into Azure ML a lot, but there's so much that they're adding to it. It's awesome. I think it's one of the best tools in Azure ML. It makes us absolutely no money, but it's an awesome tool. And here's a picture of the workbench for those that haven't seen it. I'm talking like there's 90 students in here. There's 2 of you now. Yeah, this is nice because this is actually based on, this isn't my model, but this is very similar to what I do. Where they've split the data, they've got 2 class, and they've got a support vector matrix and a boosted decision tree. And then they've done, that's kind of odd, another split in the data, the sweep of, oh, okay, see why. And then they score, and then they actually take the 2, and then you can see the area under the curve and the confusion matrix at the bottom of that, and actually see which one performs better. I've actually arced it out, and you won't see this in the test. I don't think you'll see anything really complex about it, but if you see over here where it says put Python language models and all this stuff, this has changed so much since this was put out. So, any questions about that part? We've got about 28 minutes left. Speaking fast, it's easy with 2 people. So this is the operationalization part. This is an important part, right? Because we need to be able to operationalize everything we can so we can produce desired results and all that stuff. So the key aspects of the operating the solution, again, ADF, ADF, ADF. If you don't understand ADF inside of this, I think it's going to be a real challenge. The thing I would caution is that there's a lot of new stuff. I don't know if you guys go into ADF, but there's a lot of new stuff that they're putting in preview that does some really nice stuff where it'll spin up on-demand Hadoop clusters much easier, that does data copies and everything else, and it'll connect to a lot of different data sources, and it'll generate everything for you without you writing 1 bit of JSON. That is not in the exam. The old stuff is in the exam. So understanding, I think the biggest pieces are understand the basic tenets, what it's there for, and also when to use it, when not to use it, when to use data management gateway with it. Again, I can't get more into that. And then monitoring, alerting, right? Knowing, understanding how to regenerate the storage keys is definitely a plus without breaking everything, right? And you know, if you've got a policy to rechange passwords and keys every 90 days, a best practice, for instance, right, never share the primary key with customers or vendors. Always give them a secondary key. If you want to cut off from access to the data, just change that key, right? But it gets a little bit more complex than that when you're talking about a real world commercialization of it. And again, data management gateway. Have you guys set up data management gateway? It's not that hard. It's actually one of the easier tools that'll actually download and generate a key for you. So it's a very secure key protected environment. But once you set it up, there are a few caveats to understand about it, is that you can only have 1 data management gateway on a server. Now that data management gateway can connect to multiple services, but it's basically a secure access point to your network. So if you want to connect to an Oracle database and the TISA, SQL Data Warehouse, SQL Server, you can set up those connections in that gateway, and then your queries can be written from Data Factory. So it's nice because what Data Factory gives you over SSIS is the full data lineage, right? The problem is we've got the data lineage that everybody's been asking for, but we have nobody using that data lineage to actually do anything with it. And my concern is that data lineage is great as long as you're consuming and utilizing it and have a plan for it. If you're trying to find a problem 2 weeks after it happened, you're going to have a lot of stuff to trudge through. I mean, it is. The other thing is to be cognizant that everything's UTC timestamped, right? So you have to know that if you schedule something for a certain amount of time, that it's going to start at different time from East Coast time. So that kind of stuff. You also want to have alerts and ADF event monitoring going on. These are some of the don't worry about pieces of the test. They said SQL Server 2016. Depending on when you take it, I would worry a little bit about SQL Server 2016. There's not a lot of syntax. That's very true. Some of the stuff that you'll see is not heavy in syntax. He put data lake and SQL DW. Again, this was done in July. Lots changed in Azure since July. And if you guys haven't used SQL Data Warehouse or Data Lake, they're actually really good, and they integrate well with Data Factory as well. Everything. The nice thing with the cloud is everything's there once it's there, right? You don't have to know anything about the backbone, the 10 gig backbone. You don't have to know anything about ExpressRoute other than where it might play in a architectural design, but you don't have to know how to set it up or anything like that. Parting thoughts, I would give her a prize, but there's prizes all over the place here. Anybody know who said this? I don't know has become I don't know yet. Anybody? Bill Gates. I had to find that nugget. It's true. With this day and age, information is everything. Being able to be the guy that owns and has access to that data is always good. Some of the things, of course, always eat a good meal. Don't eat too many carbs, especially if you're old like me. You'll fall asleep. Said that. Read the questions. A lot of us like to skim and think that we got the gist of it early on. It's a good idea to read the whole thing and make sure you actually understood it. With the, like I said, I do use the notepad religiously. I will do an outline of a scenario just like I would if it were a whiteboard. If I could take my whiteboard with me, I would, because I do everything on a whiteboard. And think it through. Make sure that you understand that there may be elements within a use case or in a scenario that aren't necessarily meant to throw you off. They're just kind of, I don't know, things that could take you off on a tangent that aren't necessary. So focus on what's being asked. Right, in the Marine Corps, they said you can't solve a problem unless you know what it is, right? And this is the same thing. First, you have to identify the problem. So if they're asking you to set up a network connection between a local domain and the cloud, data management gateway and ADF is probably the answer. But understanding that problem is definitely a thing. Relax. And again, this is meant for Microsoft employees. Nobody's going to beat you with a stick if you fail it. In fact, everybody's going to say, "Did you fail it?" First time around. It's expected, but it's more of being able to go to that testing environment and understand. The last one I went to, it was chaos. It was like people had their kids outside, and it was at a community college. And I was like, I'm not going back here again. But it does help to go take a test, study for it, and then see what the environment's going to be like that you're going to actually take it. You do get a retest since these are out. I already said that. And, you know, relax. Here's a few questions. Actually, they're next, I think. Yeah. So in this we did, I mean, I understand that they say these are sessions that are help you to prepare for exam. Only you can prepare for the exam. This is just to kind of give you some ideas of what to focus on to be most successful at it. And also we wanted you to know the areas that you need to be familiar with. And I think that comes out loud and clear. You need to understand a good portion of everything that has to do with big data. It's a big swath, especially when I've been doing this for 5 years with the MPP architectures and the big data stuff itself. And I keep asking, when are y'all going to quit adding stuff to my plate? Because, I mean, this industry, if you want to just do Hadoop, you could do Hadoop. If you want to just do machine learning, you could be a data scientist with a little bit of R and Python and the statistical background and just never touch another tool. But here, as Microsoft folks, we are expected to know a lot more. And then learn how to study the right material, right? Always want to learn to focus on what's important. I think every guide out there is pretty good on it. If you go to the Microsoft 475 site, the stuff that they have in there is really relevant. I've never seen it mislead me in a bit. And every time I've taken the time to actually go through it, and it does take time. It physically takes time to go through it. And the edX is something new that I would highly recommend. You can audit every one of those. They're designed to be 8-week classes, but there's so much. And if you get the chance, if you really want to beef up on Azure ML, do a competition. You guys are familiar with those? There's prizes for those too. It's intimidating. I'll tell you, the first time I did it, I've been doing this for 25 years. First time I did that competition, I was like, I don't want anybody to see my score. I don't want to be judged, right, based on that. But it was funny. I met with a couple of guys that we did the competition for the first time. We all kind of felt the same way. And we all took a different approach. One guy was really heavy into R, so he did a lot of his, we were in the same competition. And he did things a certain way. Me, I look at a lot of my customers that I'm trying to bring over. They're SQL guys, they're BI guys, and they know SQL. And I wanted to be able to go through without writing any R code. Now, at the end of the day, I got a better AUC and I got a better result set by doing R. I could have brought my points up, but I could get a more than a passing score by just using SQL. And the SQL inside of Azure ML, keep in mind, is SQLite. It's very, very rudimentary, I guess. It's simple. Has no advanced functions or anything. But it's nice to be able to have that flexibility that, yes, you can do it with this, but if you take a little bit of time, learn some R, learn some basic Python, you're going to do a lot more with it, right? Learn what smoke does. Learn how to handle null values or redundant or duplicate values. The data cleansing piece is going to, it changes so much. And the biggest piece, I wish we had some tools like Jump inside of Azure ML, because it's really nice to be able to just do a simple analysis on the data and see if it's categorized properly, right? I think it's a very comprehensive tool from what I saw as a beginning application, but it's taken a lot further. But do a competition for sure. And then went too far. You can't do these; those are all gone. But the other, let me pull the other deck up so I can show y'all. I don't know if y'all use the same training stuff that we do. And you'd think I'd have them memorized by now. Oh, Pearson. Do you guys use Pearson? So Pearson has, they do the training where you can actually, I think it's $99 if you go through the Microsoft site, but it's as close to the real exams as I've seen. And the questions are eerily close to it. But Microsoft, internally, we use it as well. So we get vouchers for free ones, but it's still good. So we've got about 15 minutes for questions, if there are any. I'm sure you guys could come up with some.
Do you know if the data science certification is going to become an official Microsoft?
That's a good question. They started out calling it the professional degree with the data science track. And I think because they were using the term degree, that in some countries and stuff that had some kind of connotation that it carried. And it was their original goal to have actually some accreditation. But the way it works out is that they're not able to do it. So it's now called the Microsoft Professional Program. I think it's if what your goal is to have something on your resume like a Coursera certified thing, I think it's going to carry that same type of weight. But it's going to have the Microsoft name attached to it, which may or may not add any credibility to it. But if your goal is to really learn as someone that's trying to really get into the data scientist, I would say that architects, developers, or just analysts that want to get into data science, it's a great course if you follow it to learn. And Power BI, it gets really deep. Excel, it gets extremely deep. And the SQL Server stuff does probably one of the best introduction to SQL courses I've seen. And I've seen a lot of introduction to SQL courses. But it does really well on all those aspects. Where it struggles, I think, and it's some growing pains with when you do the Python stuff, when it gets into Pandas and NumPy, they're using version 2 instead of version 3, and there's a trade-off between that, right? If you do the PCA analysis, there's some growing that it needs to do there. I think the R was simpler at the end of the day. It's a higher level language, but the Python, I think we're going to see more and more people because there's a lot of Python users out there. So. But I would recommend it to anybody that wants to see what it's all about. Yeah.
I started auditing it, I just wondered.
Yeah, I mean, I hope it grows, and I think that the plan is not to abandon it. I think they want to see it, because their goal is to get people, people that are intimidated by business or that have left technology to kind of get interested. This is a new track that we can't fill enough seats, guys. And we're putting out 45,000 computer science degrees a year, or wait a minute, 5,000 computer science degrees a year, and we got 45,000 new jobs created. It's ridiculous the amount of gap there is. But it's also amazing. This year I've seen more people that have data science on their title that have no reason carrying that title yet. So.
Were you referring to the professional program?
Yeah. It was. I enjoyed it. It was. I did it while I was doing a couple other classes as well, and I tested it out on several, like the SQL stuff. I tested it out. I know that there's plans probably to make it to where you can't test out, but the course on stats was from Columbia, and they've got quite a few very key people in stats that are, and there's a couple one from Duke. But the nice part is that outside of Columbia, all the stuff is Microsoft, and they may have a professor from Duke or some other places that are teaching kind of the basic statistics part, and then they'll have a colleague that's a Microsoft person that walks you through, here's how to do it in Azure ML. And that was, I thought, very useful because it's the practical application of what they're sharing. Yeah, yeah. And there were also some third-party companies that they use that were, one was something Data Guru, or a couple other that are third-party open source that did the Pandas, or the Python, and I think the R was in-house. But they were good. The basic stuff was good. The secondary stuff was good, but again, there were some problems with the libraries at the time. And Microsoft is big in open source too. Thank you. Have a great sessions.